Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please find your seats. We'll get started with this evening's program. My name is David Bobb. I serve as president of the Bill of Rights Institute. I'm delighted to welcome all of you here to this Kansas Public Lecture. It's an annual event made possible by the Fred and Mary Koch Foundation. We're so grateful for their support in making possible this conversation with Senator Ben Sasse. We're delighted this evening to be able to have the opportunity to talk with Senator Sasse about his important new book. It's called The Vanishing American Adult, Our Coming-of-Age Crisis and How to Rebuild a Culture of Self-Reliance. The Bill of Rights Institute features the American idea in the words of the Declaration of Independence in our mission and vision statements. We seek to equip young people to be able to understand their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that they might not just mouth those words, but really internalize, own that idea. And just prior to this evening's event, Senator Sasse was able to take questions from a good number of students, mainly from the Wichita area. And we're so delighted that they and many of their teachers are able to join us this evening. Our purpose at the Bill of Rights Institute is to work with those teachers across the country, some 50,000 strong that constitute about a quarter of America's secondary school teachers in history, civics, and the teaching of the American idea. To help those teachers, we publish curricula, including textbooks. We do professional development training sessions around the country, including one that recently was held in this city, in Wichita, with the United School District 259. About 250 teachers from across the area gathered to study the Constitution. Now, I have to pause and mention that there was one headline today that you might have missed. It appeared in The Onion. Here's the headline. The Supreme Court admits it mistakenly used Belgian Constitution for last three rulings. Now, our distinguished guest this evening has reflected deeply on the meaning of the American Constitution. I don't know, maybe he's thought about the Belgian Constitution as well. But
only when given speeches for The Onion.
Exactly, that's great. What does it mean for us to be a creedal nation? That's one of the things that we're going to talk about this evening. Our speaker is a fifth-generation Nebraskan. He's a Cornhusker through and through.
Go Big Red.
I know that's a controversial thing to say here, but nonetheless, questions and answers later, right? With degrees from Harvard, Yale, and St. John's College, Dr. Sasse is a historian. He's taught at the University of Texas in Austin. He has a varied and diverse array of areas that he's worked in, including business consultancy in the U.S. House of Representatives as a chief of staff, and most recently, before being elected senator from the state of Nebraska, president of Midland University. Now, I mentioned that this book, I think, is an important one, but it's not important in the way that you might think of sort of the Washington definition of important. I happen to live in the Washington, D.C. area, and there's something called a Washington read. A Washington read is when you pick up a book and you look to the back and you look to the index to see if your name is in it. That's the kind of town that Washington is. But when you read this book, what you find is Augustine and Aquinas, Plato and Shakespeare, Madison and Twain, the poetry and prose of American democracy. And what we're so excited about to be able to do tonight is to focus our attention on those themes. And so I'd ask that as you participate in this conversation, by calling up on your phones or other devices, sli.do.com. sli.do.com. It's on the screen there. If you enter at the hashtag mark, all you have to enter is X100, and then type in your question. But we ask that you make the questions really focused on the themes at hand. And the three things that I really want to focus in our conversation with Senator Sasse about are, one, the relationship between culture and politics. Secondly, an idea that he advances that's really one of the touchstones in this book, embrace work pain. Embrace work pain. Why is it so important to have a strong work ethic? And then third, the senator's injunction to us as a people that we revive civic education. So I would invite your questions along those themes or others that are taken up over the course of the evening, but rather than talk about the sort of things of Washington and what's happening in our nation's politics right now, that we go to a subject that the senator has called upstream from that place. And in fact, let me take my seat and we'll get started with the conversation precisely along those lines. Please join me in welcoming Senator Ben Sasse.
I haven't been on Twitter in the last couple hours anyway, so I'd have nothing to say on the current events. I don't know what's happened.
That's great. Well, speaking of Twitter, you tweeted this past summer and write in the book something that I think is an important part of a point of departure. Culture, and here I'm quoting from you, is upstream from politics. Culture is upstream from politics. I wonder if you might start our conversation by just telling us what do you mean by that?
Boy, if I'd have known I was going to have to answer that, I'd have thought more before I wrote it. I think, well, so let's define some terms for a minute, maybe, right? Politics is, the word comes from polis, right, meaning the affairs of the city in Greece. But we use politics to mean government most of the time. And government is about power. Government is about compulsion. And most things that are interesting in life aren't about power and compulsion. They're about voluntary choice. They're about persuasion. They're about passion projects. They're about love. Right? So the things that really matter in life, the things that make you happy are, and there's lots of data on this now. As you mentioned, I'm a business strategy guy by work history, but I'm trained as an academic historian. And so I've never really done much social science or thought a lot about it, but recently I've been thinking about the happiness literature, and I say this because I know Arthur Brooks spoke here at this event a year or two ago. It turns out that there's quite a lot of social science on what makes people happy, and it ends up there are only about 4 things. Like if you ask someone on the man and woman on the street, how complicated do you think is the algorithm that determines whether or not you're happy? Most people think it's like 500 or 1,000 things that go into that equation. It turns out it's 4. Do you have a family? Do you have any friends? And by friends, I don't mean do you have 50 or 500 people on social media. I mean, do you have actual friends? And it turns out, in an Aristotelian sense, you can only have like 3 or 4 or 5 of those in your life. A friend is somebody who, when they're happy, you're happy. And when they hurt, you hurt. You don't choose to do it. It just happens because you love them, right? I mean, it's the way we parent. My daughters are 16 and 13. My son is 6. When one of my kids is hurting, I don't choose to hurt. I just ache because I love them, right? When my 6-year-old is flying down the street on his bike, grinning from ear to ear, I don't choose to be happy. I just find my shoulders going back and my cheeks turn up and I'm looking at the sun and the world is good, right? And that's what friendship is. It's an expansive sense of the self. Family, friends. Do you have a theological or philosophical worldview to make sense of death and suffering? Can you make sense of the fact that we're different than the dog? When your dog is on the porch and the sun's shining on him, he's happy, but he has no memory of bad stuff past or worry about bad stuff future. He has no nostalgic memory of good past. He has no anticipation of hope. He's just in the moment. We're not like that, right? And so we know that the world is a broken place and there's a lot of suffering. Do you have a worldview to make sense of that? And number 4, and fundamentally, do you have work? Like by far, the largest statistical driver of human happiness is, do you have work that you think matters? Not do you make enough money, or do you have ankles or knees or back that hurts at the end of the day, not is there some jackwagon 3 cubicles down that talks too loudly, but like, do I think when I leave home on Monday morning and go to work that I'm needed? If you are, you're probably going to be happy. And if you're not going to be happy. Well, those things, that's culture. Family, friends, your worldview, your work. None of that stuff can be accomplished by power. Government has a role to maintain ordered liberty so there's not violence against your family, and we care about the growing economy so that there's work. But fundamentally, government is about a framework for that ordered liberty, and that's freedom from bad stuff. Freedom to the good stuff is what determines whether or not you're happy. And that's what I mean, that culture is the important stuff, and politics only works when it's derivative of culture. If politics is trying to shape culture, everything stinks.
Along those lines, Olivia asks from the audience, we are told we are deeply divided as a nation. Are we in fact as divided as we think? And is this a result of culture or politics?
It's a good question. I think this is a bad time. I think we're really divided, and there's a lot of data that we could cite to talk about this. But what I think is happening is we are tribal, community-forming relational beings. We are social animals. We are meant to have friendships and a pack around us. We're not meant to live in isolation. And right now there's so much hollowing out of local community. There's so much loneliness. And we could talk about, I won't give my long-winded speech on the fourth revolution in the history of economics, which is what I think we're going through right now. We're transitioning. You've had hunter-gatherers, you had agrarianism, you had industrialization, the rise of cities. We have this new thing, this sort of mobile, digital, placeless economy where people are going to change jobs more rapidly than has ever happened before in human history. And I don't use those words lightly. The historian in me knows that my regular job as a historian is to be a skunk at a garden party. To say, historians tease out continuity and discontinuity over time. And people always think the moment you live out is the most interesting, radical, disrupted, crazy moment in time. Actually, it's usually not. Usually there's way more continuity than discontinuity. You just think this is a really special time because you're a narcissist and you're here, right? Like that sort of, the historian's job is to be the boring skunk at the garden party that says, no, actually, we're not changing that much. We really are changing a lot right now. And we're going from a world where hunter-gatherers and agrarians, they didn't have job choice. You just did what mom and dad, grandma and grandpa, and your aunts and uncles did. You just sort of, you didn't choose to specialize and become a thing. You just became 8 or 10 or 12 and became better at doing what the adults of your community did. Industrialization and the rise of cities created job choice, and it was really disruptive from 1870 to 1920 as people at a mass level first had job choice. Obviously, some people are always called to the clergy, and law as a discipline emerged about 200 years ago as a profession, but by and large, people just did what their parents did. And then there was job choice in the late 1800s. What we have is a world where you're going to have hyper, mega, meta job choice forever. I was born in 1972. Average duration at a firm in the 1970s was 26 years. Average duration at a firm today is 4 years and change. And it's going to get shorter and shorter forevermore. Technology is going to speed the pace of this. We're going to have 40 and 45 and 50-year-olds get disrupted out of their jobs. And what that means is hunter-gatherers had tent communities that followed the buffalo. Agrarians had villages around where they produced and fed the world or fed their community. Industrialists disrupted, but we ended up having community formed around urban ethnic neighborhoods, and you still had social density. We have a world where your job changes all the time, and so your neighborhood is a much, much more transient place than people have ever had before. And so right now, back to the question, are we disrupted right now? Are we really at war with each other? I think what's happening is we're hollowing out local community and mediating institutions. We don't know our neighbors, and we change neighborhoods all the time. And so if you have fewer local friends, we're desperate for tribe. And what's happening in our politics as we hollow out the local is we're trying to project at least anti-tribe. Nobody really believes in our tribes. Like everybody knows in our politics that all these parties stink. I'm the third most conservative guy in the Senate by voting record. So this is not an argument for the mushy middle. I'd make a case for my political view of the world. But the Republican and Democratic Party, these are not interesting groups of people for you to project your grand hopes and dreams on. But that isn't what's happening right now as we politicize more and more of the national conversation. What we're not doing is saying, oh, I really believe deeply in my party. We're saying, oh, I really believe the other people, those people are really wicked. And so we're creating anti-tribe as a substitute for the lack of local tribe. This is not going to work very well. We're going to have to build new forms of social capital. We're going to have to recognize that we're embodied local beings. You need actual friends, not just people to scream at because they're on the wrong cable network.
That's great. I wanted to pick up on what you said about kind of the pretension or the hubris to suppose that we live in particularly unique times. Because one of the contentions of your book is that with the rise of adulting, and you might say a few words about what that means and why that's such an important concept for us to really understand your thesis in this book. But if I were to offer a kind of challenge to the overall thesis, hasn't it always been thus? You know, haven't we always had a time, no matter what era, what age, whether it's America or any other society or civilization, where there is a kind of arrested development? What makes this concept of adulting unique and problematic today?
Yeah, so there are three meaty questions in there, I think. I'll tease them out. Am I an old guy screaming, "Get off my lawn"? The answer is no, but I should have to justify why. Number two, what is adulting, and really what is adolescence, which was a good innovation in human history about 2,000 years ago, and what is perpetual adolescence, which is the thing that I'm worried about in this book, and that's a really modern phenomenon. And where does it come from? I think it comes from the fact that we're raising our teens differently than teens have ever been raised before, because there's almost always been lots of necessity on the teenage years. There was things that we needed out of teenagers. And so the distinction between production and consumption was something that people knew in their bellies by experience. And our teens, by and large, don't have to learn that because production isn't required out of our teens. Well, that's new. So first, the distinction between adolescence and perpetual adolescence. Most places and most times in human history, there have been kids and there have been adults. And the difference is, are you dependent, or could you do enough to add value in your community? Largely, have you hit puberty? Have you become biologically an adult? We need you now. You got to get to work. There's a tribe next door. They want to invade us. We don't have enough food. We need you to help farm. We need you to pursue the buffalo, right? So usually there has been childhood, dependent state. We need mom. We need shelter. We need security. We need food. We can't make rational decisions. We're 2 or we're 7, right? And then you got to puberty. Now we need you. We got to push you out of the nest because you're an imperative for us. And adolescence is a concept that emerged about 2,000 years ago, where for somewhere between 18 months and 4 years, we say you get a greenhouse phase right after puberty. So your body becomes an adult, but we don't think you have to go to full-time work. You don't have to quit school and learning. You don't have to pretend you're morally fully formed. All of us who know 17, 18, 19-year-old boys, they're not morally fully formed, right? Their frontal lobe isn't developed yet. Every 17-year-old boy in the history of time has driven his car too fast, right? I mean, you know what I mean. He drove his buffalo too fast. But there was always a lack of a feedback loop about prudential decision-making. So you were not morally done. You're not school done. You're not economically and educationally done. You're not you used to have kids. Now we don't really think it's ideal for 14-year-olds to procreate. We don't form new households at that stage. So we create this protected space for adolescence. That's a good thing as long as we know it's a means to an end. It's not the end in itself. You don't want to be stuck as a teenager forever. And right now, we're drifting to a place where we're pretending the ideal time is the stage where your body became an adult and yet you don't have responsibilities and we don't demand very much of you and you can just drift. I don't think that's good for people. I don't think it's good for kids. I don't think they're ultimately happy there. And Disney remade Peter Pan as a sort of utopian thing. You could be stranded in childhood forever. Disney did that because they wanted to sell a bunch of, admissions to their movies. Go back and read the real book. The Barry book behind Peter Pan, it is a dystopian hell. So Peter Pan is a horrible human being, right? He's pushing 30 years old and he murders people, but he's so impulsive that he lives in the moment. He doesn't even have a historical memory. He doesn't remember how many people he's killed or what their names are. He doesn't care. He's stranded in this stage where his body is an adult and yet he has no accountability for his actions. We are drifting to a place, and again, I'm only 45, so I'm not doing old man screaming, "Get off my lawn." But we are drifting to a place where it's really hard demographically to tell 10 and 15 and 20 and 25-year-old boys apart. 18 to 24-year-old males, almost half of them spend a majority of their waking hours playing video games. I'm not beating up on you for having one bad, month addicted to Tetris sophomore year in college, but adolescence is a means to an end. It is not a destination. And throughout most times in history, we've needed our kids enough that protecting the space of adolescence was special, partly because they knew that they were ultimately needed. A lot of what we're communicating to our teens right now is, we don't need to teach you how to work because we don't really need you. You can just consume all the time. And it turns out life is satisfying when you're producing well, going back to that happiness literature about work. Being needed is what helps you have a sense of dignity that you can live a life of gratitude to serve your neighbor, not just consume all the time.
Right. One of the things you relate, and I think it's a great opportunity to talk a little bit more about that work ethic that you lament has faded in America. You talk a little bit about what an experience on a ranch meant for your daughter. I wonder if you could just relate a little bit about that and what that kind of opened your eyes to.
Yeah, well, I know some of you are going to dinner next, so I won't give you all the gory details of what it looks like to live and work on a ranch. But my girls are now 16, 13, and boy is 6. So 2 years ago, our daughters were 14 and 12, and I'm one of 5 people in the U.S. Senate who's never been a politician before. This is my dream job. I wasn't, sort of gearing my whole life to do this. And so we hadn't really thought through, we don't want to raise our kids, we don't want to move to DC, we don't want to raise our kids there, we don't know where they would detassel corn, and I don't know how to get kids character if you're not shipping them to the fields in the summer. But in the same regard, I didn't want to be away from my kids Monday to Friday every week. I love them, and they need dad, right? It's not ideal for me to travel 5 out of every 7 days. So we have a deal at our house where I take somebody with me most weeks. We rotate who my date is. I get home on Friday nights, my wife tells me who annoyed her most that week, they become my date for the next week. We're not recording this, right? None of my kids are here. So my kids have a lot of geographic change in their life. They have intergenerational experiences. They are exposed to things that I think are good for them. And yet, they still don't have a whole heck of a lot of work. And my wife and I felt like our 14-year-old daughter was acting kind of spoiled. And we know a lot of, Nebraska's the largest cattle state in the union now. And we know a lot of ranchers. And we were like, cow-calf season in March in Nebraska when it's cold, it's miserable. This will be good for her. So if you know cows are born at between 50 and 120 pounds, and most of them are artificially inseminated, so you have to match mom with the baby to get full payment for this baby calf. You got to know who came from whom, so you got to get them tagged quickly. Their ears can freeze. First-time mamas, they often are in duress and labor. So there's work. You got to be out there at 9, at midnight, at 3 a.m., at 6 a.m. Like, you never get a long run of sleep in the 30-plus days of cow-calving season. So we shipped our daughter off to work on this ranch and drive a pickup and go check cattle all night, every night. And she had to don rubber gloves to her shoulders. And again, I'm not telling you all the details. And she would text me, once every 3-hour shift with what she was learning. And it was just gross. Like, everything that was happening in her life, there's just a lot of poop in cattle ranch operations. And she was suffering through this in ways that were miserable, and we loved it. Like, getting your kid to suffer is one of the best ways to show them you love them.
No,
I turned them into tweets. Like, every day my daughter would text me, and I just made up #FromTheRanch, and I tweeted them out. And these things went totally viral. And I was traveling across Nebraska in the spring of 2016, and obviously the presidential election was pretty heated. And you'd think if you're a politician, sitting U.S. senator, and you go into a town, people are going to want to talk about politics. Everywhere I would go, people would just come up to me and say, I've been reading about your daughter on the ranch. Give me the guy's cell phone number. I want my kids to suffer too.
Well, from suffering to optimism, we have a question. What makes you so optimistic when there are so many things that need improvement? And you've pointed to some of the things where we've seen deterioration or the trend line is going in the wrong direction, but yet this book sounds an optimistic note. You've sounded a few of them tonight. What makes you so optimistic?
Well, the big and long answer would require us to debate theology and all sorts of things about hope and where we think history is headed, so I won't do that. But I'll say this, the book is only 1/3 analytics, sort of lay the groundwork for what this new thing is of the way we've drifted to a kind of parenting in the digital, mobile, portable, post-industrial economy. And the kind of parenting we've drifted to isn't thought out enough. So I'm not beating up on millennials in this book at all, really. So the New York Times didn't like the book, and they wanted to trash that I was some grumpy guy who's been a college president or done this and that thing, and I'm beating up on millennials. The book is not a blame-laying book at all. If you read it, it's 2/3 constructive. But to the degree I'm laying blame, the blame is on we, the parents and the grandparents, not on the kids. The kids are being raised at the richest time and place in human history, and there's a lot about that is to be celebrated. Our kids are insulated from lots of bad things, and that's a blessing. But you don't want to therefore go on to say, I want to insulate them from a lot of the good things that are the foundations of character. I don't want to protect my kid from stitches, right? I want my kid to have some scars and bloody knees and stitches. I want to protect my 6-year-old boy to not fall off the fence that he's walking on, taking some risky behavior, if he might damage his neck and end up paralyzed. But I'm not trying to protect him from falling down and cutting up his knees, because that's good. Like, that scar tissue is the foundation of future character. And we need to think, it's a little bit artificial, but we need to think, what does it look like to form work ethic in an era where we don't really need 10 and 12 and 14-year-old labor anymore? That's new in history, right? I mean, as recently as the US Civil War, economic historians estimate that more than 30% of the productive value of US households was added by kids under 14, which puberty comes earlier now than then. Lots of reasons about diet and whatnot, but basically you thought of puberty around 14, 15 back then. More than 30% of the economic value of a household was kids under 14. We don't need our kids to add any economic value. We don't know what to do with them. But we've gone from a world with production and consumption as experiences that everybody would know in their belly, to now we take our kids and we have progression through years or grades in school, and then they have all this time that's not in school, which is different kinds of consumer experiences. That's not good enough. People are happy when they're productive and when they're on their way to benefiting their neighbor, and we need to self-consciously figure out how to do that. We need to teach them to become not just functionally literate, but appetitively literate. We want them to swallow stories. We want them to care about it. We want them to travel and develop empathy. We want them to think about limiting their consumption, because it turns out lots and lots of cotton candy doesn't make you feel better afterwards. We want to figure out how to become productive. There's a lot that we need to do, and I hope that for people who are interested in the book, 2/3 of it is constructive. I hope there's something useful.
Along those lines, you chart a course in which we can begin to recover what you call Ben Franklin's nation, that idea of a people that prize work. Could you just sketch a few of those points that you think on a practical level we can do as a people to recover that esteemed place of work, particularly work with young people?
Yeah, I believe deeply that it is far easier in our modern technologically saturated economy for parents to just do every task. Every task is easier to hire out or to do yourself than to actually teach your kids to do it. One of the reasons we're not good at getting our kids a work ethic is because we're lazy at doing the work to plan to get them a work ethic. Right? Like, there's almost no task around my house that my kids really started doing in a way that they were better at it right away than me. Me setting them up to do it took far more work than me just doing it myself. And so, like, look around your house and figure out what's everything you're paying for. If you're paying somebody to mow your lawn, why in the world aren't you buying a mower and teaching your kids how to do it? Right? When your kid is 1.5 years old and he's crawling around at the base of the shower when I'm getting ready for work in the morning, I can go get my socks, but he needs to figure out how to add some value. He's 18 months now, dude. And so you teach the 18, that's not a line I've ever used before. I don't think that's gonna work. I'm gonna ditch that. But I sort of, wanted to find ways to put your kids up to different work. When you're paying the bills around your house, why are you not teaching your 14-year-old to be the CFO doing accounts payable out of your house, right? Let them write the checks and balance the checkbook. And we try in a fairly disciplined way at our house now to shift all possible work we can to our kids. We're not any good at it yet, but we almost are at a place where they do half the work that we had to do, my wife and I, mid-40s. This is a brand new thing to come about this quickly. When I graduated high school in 1990, I live in a 25,000 person ag manufacturing town about an hour outside of Omaha. When I was graduating high school, about half the kids in my town were going to go to college and half weren't. The half that were going to go to college, 1/3 of them would flunk out in the first year. So less than 1/3 of the kids I'm graduating with were going to end up sophomores in college. And yet, the 308 person graduating class, everybody I knew had worked in 1990, had done some kind of work. When I got to college in Boston, kids from 50 states and more than 50 foreign countries, again, I'm not that old. Like, this is 28, 27 years ago, everybody I knew when I got to college had worked. I became a college president in 2009 back in this same town that I'd grown up in. There's a 130-year-old liberal arts college, had lots of problems, was in danger of going bankrupt. I was there because I do turnaround stuff. And so the kids that were at our college, these were not academically elite kids. They were going to a school that had lots of problems. So probably there were bumpy things in their lives that they didn't have a guidance counselor trying to dissuade them from coming to our school 10 years ago that was having problems. And yet, less than a third of the kids had ever really done any meaningful work. That wasn't because we had this wonderful work ethic in our intrinsic character 30 years ago and they were lazy. It was that they grew up at a different time, and we've evaporated most work from our households as we've gotten to sort of suburbanized, exurbanized living as the predominant American experience. We have to self-consciously create those work experiences for our kids. The book is not about policy or politics, but if we were going to talk about the downstream policy and politics stuff, there is also a nanny state culture which tries to have the labor market insulate kids from work. Some of it intentionally, some of it unintentionally. There are things we try to do to protect kids by making them, detasseling kids. I'm sure you guys have detasseling around here. I know that we're more wheat, but if you drive just a little bit north and you get to corn country, you see kids walking around with these space suits now because some regulators said that they could get corn rash. You're in a 100-degree field in July. You're going to kill these kids of heat stroke by trying to protect them from getting a little bit of rash on their chest and neck. We got lots of stuff where we need to rethink these assumptions. Some places in the Northeast where parents have been charged with child abuse for allowing their 10 and 12-year-old kids to walk a block to the park. It is far more dangerous to have your kid not going to the park than going to the park.
Before we move to talk about the importance of reviving the teaching of civics, Mark asks, what role does moral relativism play in our culture today?
A bad one. I've had long answers. Can I just check the box and agree? I mean, let's distinguish between moral relativism and principled pluralism, right? Moral relativism is the idea that there is no order to things, that there is no right and wrong. It's an asinine philosophy, right? Nobody actually believes that. But it's sort of a lazy, because as soon as you do, then you've just declared a moral absolute that somebody else believing moral things was wrong. But let's distinguish between that and principled pluralism. Principled pluralism is the idea that worldviews are in conflict. We don't agree about everything. Well, that's American, right? The American founding was fundamentally about a whole bunch of people who believed really big and different things about heaven and hell, for example. And they decided they were going to form a polity together where we would protect each other's right to be what we might regard as wrong. I believe one thing and you believe another, and let's come together and let's form a community that says let's wrestle over the really big and important things, but let's wrestle free from violence. Let's wrestle by debate. Let's create a public square where we build a state that protects us from violence so that we can try to invite each other to my church versus your synagogue versus X versus Y versus Z, and we can debate these things by persuasion because the human soul is actually too big to be compelled by force.
That's a great segue into the question of civics, because I think you state very clearly in the book, quote, we need a baseline of knowledge, a launching pad of common values and sentiments. My question to you is, where do we begin to find this?
Well, we have some great headwaters. We have some great founts in this civilization, and maybe it's worth just thinking about 1787 together for a minute, not just to give you a shout out for being the head of the Bill of Rights Institute, but because it's actually just a great common place to start. Our founders were stunningly arrogant people, right? I mean, what they did was they made an argument that throughout most times and places in human history, they thought everybody else was wrong about the nature of government. That's pretty bold, right? The American Revolution was fought for a whole bunch of different reasons, and taxation and the distance across an economy that was changing. That's 1776. The magic of America is Philadelphia 1787. 1787, these people come together in a room and they say, you know what? We get it. The human soul is broken, and there's all sorts of nasty stuff in the world, and there's somebody who wants to take your life and your liberty and your property. And so we know that you need government. We're not utopian, idealistic, naive folks. We know that you need government. But most people in human history have always said that because you need government, because you need somebody to wield the sword to keep us from descending into anarchy, we have to be grateful for the king, and whatever he says goes. The king is first, power is first, and rights are derivative. If you have rights, it's because the king in his beneficence grants you some of these rights. The American founders said, no, actually, that's backwards. We should all agree the world's broken and we're going to need government, but let's start with something more fundamental. We believe in universal human dignity. There were 4 million Americans at that time. Today we got 320 million of us. There's 7.2 billion people on the earth. And we believe that 7.2 billion people are created with dignity. We think they're created as image bearers of God, and they have natural rights. And government is just our shared project to secure those rights. Government is not the author or source of our rights. People and dignity comes first, and government is just a tool. Government doesn't come first and grant us rights. So that means all sorts of things. It means that we don't assume that the passive assumption on starting a new venture, either a for-profit, small business, or a venture philanthropy, we don't think the passive assumption is prohibition. We think the passive assumption is permission. The government might prohibit specific things for specific reasons, but if the government doesn't have a legitimate reason to prohibit something, then we get to do it. Compare that with England pre-1776. You want to start a business? Great. You go and supplicate before the king in his court, and you see if he gives you a charter. And if he doesn't, it's illegal. The passive assumption is prohibition. The American founders reversed that. And in that idea of universal human dignity, you find the headwaters of how you can get to lots of shared belief and honest debate about all the really important stuff which happens locally. I'll pull up here, but Margaret Thatcher, when you say, what is American exceptionalism? It is that. It's not, American exceptionalism isn't a claim that we are sort of superior to other people. There are a whole bunch of nut jobs right now out there wanting to advance a kind of theory of conservatism that's called blood and soil nationalism. It's a really bad un-American idea. And it's a claim that American exceptionalism is somehow we're ethnically superior to other people. No, it's not. American exceptionalism is recognizing that historically what happened in 1787 was a great argument, and the world benefits from this understanding of universal human dignity. Margaret Thatcher had the famous line, Europe is a bunch of nations founded by history. America is the only nation founded by philosophy, which is what you were saying in your opening about the creedal nature of what it means to be an American. America isn't just about a place, though it's that, but America's an idea. I was having dinner with Bono last year, and he all of a sudden at one point just sort of says out of the blue, you know the thing about America? He goes, I love Ireland, right? We're the most beautiful people on earth, and we make the best music, and the island is emerald, golden, beautiful. He goes, but nobody would say Ireland is an idea. America is an idea. Where you are from, everybody on earth looks to America as this place that believes in universal human dignity. It's a pretty good place to start.
It's a great place to start. One of the challenges. One of the challenges we see, and this came up in the student forum just a few minutes ago, with social media, is that it has the tendency to exacerbate our polarization. Could you say a few words about how we can, in this social media saturated world in which we live, counteract that tribalism or that polarization and point the way to this idea that can act to bind us together?
Yeah. So first of all, recognize that human bodies matter, right? It matters that we have bodies. We live in space and time. And it turns out your real friends are people that you actually know and break bread with. They have bodies. Social media can do all sorts of things to augment those relationships. I have basically my 9 best buddies from college are all coming in this weekend to watch Nebraska upset Ohio State in football. You Kansas folks know that we used to be really great. Nebraska is the winningest team in the last 50 years in college football because we were great from 50 years ago till 17 years ago. We've fallen on hard times. We are the biggest underdog of my lifetime this weekend. Anyway, I digress. I have 9 buddies coming in to watch the Ohio State-Nebraska football game with me. Social media has been a real blessing to those friendships because as we've had the 3 or 4 month run up to this, we're sort of in constant dialogue by email or Facebook or Twitter or whatever. And it's going to be a better experience when we get together starting Thursday night for this long weekend because some of us who haven't maybe seen each other in 18 or 24 months are all caught back up and we've been planning for this moment. But that's augmenting relationships of actual people who know each other. Right? If you think social media can substitute for real human relationships, all the data shows you're going to be lonely. Like, there's just tons of data on this. You don't have to be a conservative as I am to believe this. Robert Putnam, a center-left guy who's written all sorts of interesting things. His book, Bowling Alone, sort of broke through into mainstream consciousness 15-ish years ago. He has a new book out right now that I'd highly recommend called Our Kids, came out last year. The term our kids in 1950s, 60s America would have been heard in everybody's ear in a communitarian sense. Our kids are those kids in our neighborhood. Our kids are those kids 1 and 2 and 3 miles away, maybe different socioeconomic levels, but we care about them because we're a part of this polity together. We're a part of this republic together. We're part of this neighborhood together. They're our kids. Our kids now reads in the polling data overwhelmingly as to mean just your biological progeny. Just your kids. And it turns out as we have more and more privatized experience and less connection to our neighbor, people are thinking that social media can replace that, and it can't. It turns out if you go from 0 to 50 to even 200 Facebook friends, it tells you something about your local community network, and you are happier probably if you have 50 than 0 and 200 than 50. But you're not happier with 500 than 200. You're actually slightly less happy. And if you have 1,000 social media friends, you actually are spending a lot of time curating those relationships, and they're coming at the cost of actual relationships that you have. So one thing we need to be mindful of is the way digital consumption is changing our experience. Wall Street Journal had a great piece on it this week on the smartphone, but if you want to Google it, Atlantic Monthly had a wonderful piece last summer called "Is Your Smartphone Stealing Your Brain?" And there's a whole bunch of things that are happening in habit formation for teens and 20-somethings where we're displacing real human relationships with social media, and it doesn't yield greater happiness. Last point. And I've tried not to say anything too controversial. I wasn't trying to get into politics, but I worry that this might be misinterpreted that way, but please hear me out. Putin is a really, really bad guy. Putin is an enemy of free speech, free press, free religion, freedom of association. He is a really bad guy. There is nobody on earth happier about American on American discord than Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin can cut his budget for ships and tanks right now as he spends a little bit more on propaganda and info ops, and he is winning. So I don't mean to get anywhere near the actual controversy of the way we do policing and the NFL's response to that and President Trump's response to Kaepernick. That's not my point. There's a big and important debate there, and thoughtful, loving neighbors will try to empathize and understand the other side of a lot of those debates. I'm not here to talk about that. There is policing debate. There was a Kaepernick protest. There was President Trump deciding to exacerbate those scabs. All that bracket for a minute. I'm not talking about what your view is on any side of that issue. After that exploded 2 weeks ago, do you know that 2 of the largest trending hashtags in the world instantly became hashtag take a knee NFL and hashtag stand for the anthem? How do you think that happened? Vladimir Putin made that happen. There are bot farms all across Russia that loaded American social media with hashtag take a knee and hashtag stand for the anthem. He doesn't give a rip about patriotism to the American flag. He wants Americans to hate each other. And right now, he's really, really good at this. I spend a lot of time doing intelligence work in the US Senate. I spend a ton of time in the classified bunker. And when you actually read what intercepts we get for what Putin is doing, he is just happy as a pig in mud, just spending money to exacerbate American discord, and you do a lot of that through social media. Something like 30% of Twitter accounts are fake, and that's largely funded by foreign intelligence services to make us hate each other.
You talk about in the book, and touched on this just a little bit today, the warehousing of students. If we move from the K-12 space, where that has become a problem, to the college sphere, it was interesting you mentioned that about half of your high school classmates would have been heading off to college and the other half to pursue a career right away. There's a question from the audience that asks, do you believe that education influences how engaged we are, how much involved in civil society we are? And we used to suppose that college would be a preparation for that, but there would be lots of other pathways. Do you care to comment on that question?
Great, and let's distinguish between education and schooling, because education is the big noble thing. Schooling is a tool, really important means to an end. I'm not attacking schooling, right? I'm a former college president. My wife's been an inner city biology teacher and administrator. My dad was a lifelong high school teacher and football and wrestling coach, so I believe deeply in American schooling. And yet, really important to be able to look at your tools with skepticism. And a school is just a tool. And so we should understand where we are in human history and how recent it is that we've thought schooling is the only way. And I don't mean just schooling in terms of through age 18. I mean schooling in terms of a universalized assumption about college now. By the way, 41 of 50 governors in the country have recently, over the course of the last decade, renamed their old K-12, kindergarten through grade 12 bureaucracy. They've renamed them P-16 bureaucracies to mean preschool through grade 16. That's a terrible idea. This book is not about policy or politics, but I'll get on my high horse about policy for a minute. Grade 13 is a disastrous way to serve 19-year-old kids. You do not want your people 7 and 8 and 9 years past adolescence to be in something that functions like grade school. It is not a good thing for 19-year-old kids to be indoors, passively sitting and learning from some other sage on the stage. We need them to be passionate about learning, to be shaking the trees of knowledge, to be throwing open the doors of the library, to be wanting the internship, to be wanting to get through school because it becomes a means to an end. Of course, I believe in the liberal arts, but I mean the sort of pre-vocational part of school. If you don't know why you're in college, don't be there. Know what you're trying to get out of it and recognize it as a means to an end. And when you use the data from me graduating high school in my little town 27 years ago, whatever it would be, and 50% of the kids go to college. I was a college president from 8 years ago to 3 years ago. And I looked at the data at that point, and Nebraska graduating high school kids, it was at the beginning of that window, so data was a couple years old, so place this 10 plus years in the past. 29% of Nebraska high school kids who graduated high school tried college as their next step 10 plus years ago. It had fallen from 29 to 18%. Sorry, I got the math wrong. 29% didn't go straight to college, and it went down to 18%, only 18% not going straight to college in graduation. How many more college graduates do you think we have in Nebraska now than 15 years ago? None. There are no more people graduating from college in Nebraska now than 15 years ago. What we do is we flunk a lot of them out as sophomores because we don't actually have any use for them. We don't have these other pathways and plans for how you become an adult and how you get prepared to work. And so we just act like this one form is the right form for everybody, even though the data shows that's not what's happening. We just don't have enough institutional pluralization for these coming-of-age institutions. I think we need radically pluralized institutional form for 18 to 22-year-olds, which is when we think of sort of residential learning. But we need different institutional forms for 40 and 45 and 50-year-olds as well, because those are the people who are being disintermediated out of jobs. That's never happened before in human history that you've thought that 40 and 45 and 50-year-olds will regularly lose their jobs. That's the world where your kids and grandkids are headed, or where you 17 and 18-year-olds are headed. You're headed to a world where not just your job, not just your firm, but your whole industry is going to cease to exist when you're 40, and again when you're 47, and when you're 52. We have to create a civilization of lifelong learners. No one's ever done that before. That's going to be a big challenge. We're going to have to succeed at it to maintain a republic. But we need more institutional form, not more homogenization of that form.
Picking up on that, what do you see that gives you confidence going forward? You know, one of the touchstones you have in this book is Alexis de Tocqueville and the vibrancy that he saw. He didn't go to Washington, D.C. and say, this is it, right? That's a point that you make. He went out into other parts of our land and saw this kind of dynamism. Where do you see that kind of rigorous thinking that kind of innovation that can propel us into the place that we need to be and the educational sort of lifelong learning path.
Yeah, so I think we're going through a bumpy time, and yet I do think the seeds are there of what having Tocquevillian, since you bring up Tocqueville, Tocquevillian civil society can flower again, but it's going to require lots of new institution building. This is not to pander to you, but I know you all at the Bill of Rights Institute are training lots of school teachers across the country in some of your opening comments. That is an innovation that came about through an experiment, right? Lots and lots of experiments in America fail. That's a gift, right? If you try to define the one way to build the iPhone and you had Ma Bell do it as a government contract in 1955, we would never get the iPhone, right? What you needed is Silicon Valley funding lots and lots of different things. The vast majority of them that get funded by venture capital go bankrupt. That's all right. That's sort of a winnowing process where failure is a fine way to experiment, right? In baseball, you're in the Hall of Fame if you get 3 out of 10 hits. In America, we believe in that cultural pluralism and a lot of that dynamism that comes from innovation. Your Tocqueville line, I won't give my big version of the story that I tell in the book, but it is relevant that Tocqueville was stunned to find so much economic dynamism in America. Europeans were surprised, right? So Tocqueville's writing mostly in the 1840s. We think of our founding as 1776 or 1787. Europeans didn't really think of us as truly independent till we won the War of 1812. The Brits had been distracted. King George was crazy. They were at war with France. So when we win the War of 1812, they now think we're truly independent. And they think it's kind of interesting. These religious zealots at the perimeter of the earth are out there, and they have pluralism. It's interesting in a philosophical sense, but they didn't expect that we would be economically dynamic. 2 decades later, by the 1830s, we have all this economic dynamism in America. Right? We have the canal revolution, we have the railroad revolution, we have the proto-putting out revolution, which was like a factory system where you didn't yet organize all the labor inputs around the one assembly line, but the product moved around to different kind of craftspeople. Really interesting things are happening. And so Tocqueville decides, I will explain American innovation to Europeans. I'll explain to the French what they did. And so he sort of makes himself a travel writer. If you own Democracy in America, it's 1,500 pages long. Don't read it like that. It's really boring. Rip the binding off and leave it in 5- and 7-page chunks all over your house, just staple chunks of it together, and read it like it's magazine articles, because that's what he really wrote. Then it's great stuff. In 5- to 7-page chunks, it's great. When he was trying to get a payday out of it by making it a 1,500-page book, not so good. What he did was he said, I want to figure out why America is dynamic. And since there's this really interesting economy, they must have the best bureaucrats. That's what he thought. And so he goes to Washington, D.C. to define the meaning of America. And he writes back to Europe. He's like, this is a problem. Like, I went to Washington, D.C. It's a swamp. The people don't work very hard. They're not that impressive. Not a lot's changed. And he says that he's sort of, this isn't the meaning of America. I got to find it. And so there are 25 states at the time. He travels to 17 state capitals. And he writes back to Europe, I have found the meaning of America. It's the Rotary Club. It's like, these people are weird. Like, we Europeans thought you have community or individualism. You have government-defined, bureaucratically organized, homogenous community, or you have loners off in the Montana woods, right? He goes, turns out these Americans have this whole other idea. They believe in community, but that's voluntary. And so you have to persuade people to join your church. You don't get a charter from the king that you're the one established religion and you get tax dollars. You have to persuade people to buy your mousetrap. You have to persuade people to invest in your new company, to join your venture philanthropy, to marry you, whatever. It's by voluntarism. His way of saying is, Americans don't believe in power, they believe in love. They believe in passion projects, right? We still believe that. We still have that kind of dynamic innovation, that grass tops Tocquevillian localism. If stuff bumps down in Wichita and it's going to come back up, it's not going to come back up because Washington creates a great bureaucratic program for Wichita renewal, right? It's going to come up because people in this community at the grass tops level will persuade a bunch of people. You'll experiment. A whole bunch of them will fail, and some of them will thrive. We're going to build new forms of social capital for the mobile digital economy. We just don't know what it looks like yet. We're going to need neighborhoods again.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and this is a composite of a number of the threads that we've heard from students who are here. For those who are interested in making a difference, whether it be through social entrepreneurship or going into politics and public service and trying to craft real policy solutions, what words of advice can you offer in closing? You've been careful to note that your book is not a policy tome. But for those who wish to make a difference in policy, what advice do you have for them and for us?
I mean, I don't want to say something that sounds pie in the sky, but I really do believe what ails us at this moment is a kind of epidemic of loneliness, a decline of neighborliness. And I don't mean that in a sort of touchy-feely, can't we all just talk nicer to each other? That'd be fine. We should do that. But that's not what I mean. I really mean we need to revivify neighborhoods. And I mean that in a physical sense, but I also mean it in a relational sense, right? We're clearly going to know more people and have more of those relationships be shallower than before. That's inevitable. But when you think about what's really going to fix so much of what ails us in this moment, a very, very small piece of it is really going to be driven by policy. I'm in government for a time. I have a 6-year calling. I've been there 2.5 years. And there are big policy things I care about, right? So the last major piece of social economic policy innovation in America was about 30 years ago, 1986. We sort of went from having a defined benefit retirement pension to that if you wanted to change jobs and you were 28 or 48 in the past, you had to abandon your pension. It was a big job lock constraint in a world where I said we've gone from 26-year duration at a firm to 4 years and change today. Like, as that was evolving over the course of the last decades, we made an innovation that made it possible for you to have a tax-protected portable 401k plan. That's really good. That's a good thing. It's not enough for 30 years of output in policy, right? And you could say, we can have debates about healthcare and how much the government should subsidize it, and if you're like me and you want much more local, decentralized regulation than having one-size-fits-all insurance regulation from Washington, we could debate right versus left on that. That's fine. But we should all recognize that one of the, statistically, the biggest driver of uninsurance in America right now is just job change, and we don't even know how to talk about that together. Right? What is the biggest driver of uninsurance in America? Right? You ask man and woman on the street, they think pre-existing medical conditions, we must have more sick people, or socioeconomics, we must have more poor people. Neither of those things are true. We don't have more sick people, and we don't have more poor people. The reason we have had massively growing uninsurance over the course of the last 30 years is just because we change jobs more. The average uninsurance period when you change jobs is 4 to 6 months. Well, if you're changing jobs every 4 years, 6 months out of every 4 years is 1/8 of the time. That's 12.5% of your neighbors. That's dang close to what the uninsured population is of America. Well, during those 4 to 6 months, maybe when you get the breast cancer diagnosis, and maybe when you have the car accident, now you're the pre-existing conditions population of 5 and 10 years from now, right? That's an example of a policy solution we need. I care about that. If you believe there's a healthcare reform innovation that's going to come from politics that's going to fix our lack of neighborliness and our loneliness, you're smoking something, right? What's really happening is we have far fewer real textured relationships. And I think that what's going to happen with the evolution of social capital is going to be fascinating. We've been through this once before, well, twice. When hunter-gatherers settled down and started farming, it clearly radically changed their societies. We just don't know what it looked like because we didn't have alphabets, right? This is 11,000 years ago. But 150 years ago, from 1870 to 1900, 1920, as people left the farm and went to the cities, 86% of people lived and worked on farms at the end of the Civil War. 6 out of 7 people, okay? 60% of Americans live and work in cities by World War II. So more than half. You go from 6 out of 7 people on farms to almost 2 out of 3 people in cities over 70 years. It was a bipartisan consensus of politicians in America. Woodrow Wilson, Democrat, Teddy Roosevelt, Republican. America won't work anymore. People can't have self-restraint, self-control, self-discipline. There's no way the small r, not Republican Party, but the experiment of self-rule in a republic, it won't work in cities, they all thought. In the 19-teens, both parties thought we needed a rule of bureaucratic experts from Washington, D.C., because people in cities are way too stupid to govern themselves, was the assumption. right? And so we did things like pass a law, a constitutional amendment for prohibition. It was terrible policy. And yet, it makes perfect sense if you go back and sit in that historical moment. There were drunk 15-year-old Irish kids passed out in the streets everywhere. That was actually what was happening in New York and Boston and Baltimore and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And what ended up happening is we created new forms of social capital for the urban ethnic neighborhood that were different than the New England village or the Kansas prairie village or the Nebraska prairie village. But it turned out that neighborliness was again known. You had accountability for your actions. Your word mattered. Self-discipline, self-restraint, self-control are superior to other discipline, other restraint, governmental control. We believe in dignity. We believe in freedom. And so we need to build new kinds of social capital. Not much of that's really going to come from policy, though there are lots of policy implications. So to put a fine bow on it, if you're 15 and you think you want to go into politics, write that in a box somewhere and think about it again in 25 or 30 years and go do something that benefits an actual neighbor now.
Great. Thank you so
Thanks.
much, Senator.
Thanks. Bye-bye.